Several countries have been gripped by violent protests that have caused massive damage to infrastructure. The United Kingdom is on edge as protesters took to the streets at the weekend, believed to be linked to anger over a 17-year-old wielding a knife attacking children at a dance class. While anti-government protests turned deadly in Bangladesh, some Nigerians were also killed in the country as the demonstrations over the deepening cost of living crisis continue. Let's look at these issues and more now with SABC News International editor Sophie Mokoena, who's joining us live now. Sophie, thank you so much for your time this evening. I mean, the UK Prime Minister condemning what he has called far-right thuggery and says those involved will regret it. What is the latest with regards to the protests in that country?
Well, we know that in some parts protests are continuing, but as you pointed out, the Prime Minister has decided to call an emergency meeting of the security personnel, and he has also indicated a few minutes ago that they will have the military also on standby, because when you look at what transpired yesterday, a lot of damage to property, and also that standoff spoke to the divisions in that country, and there are fears that if he doesn't act decisively, the country is going to be engulfed in a more protracted violent period with those two different groups fighting each other. As you know, that the right-wing group is attacking those who are perceived as supporters of the Muslim community, and also you have people now retaliating. And at the end of the day, when you look at what is happening in that country, you can see that the issue of racial tension, also the issue of different groupings, is now dominating the news headlines in that country and around the world. And therefore, it doesn't paint a good picture in terms of the politics, but also security in that country. We saw earlier on Nigeria issuing an advisory note to citizens of Nigeria in that country and those who would want to travel to the United Kingdom, and we expect more countries to do the same. The irony is that the very same Nigeria is currently experiencing protests.
And you talk about Nigeria and the protests that are ongoing there. President Bola Tinubu appealing for protesters to end, what he's called deadly protests and bloodshed. But it doesn't seem like the young people are heeding the call as they feel unheard.
Much as the protests are not as strong as they were last week, but you still have many young people who are out in the streets and who don't agree or who were not convinced last night by the speech of the president of Nigeria. They are saying that he didn't go far enough in terms of addressing their concerns, and therefore they are continuing. But the issue is, will they have that endurance in terms of sustaining and continuing with these protests? But clearly the government is shaken, and that is why the president had to address the nation.
And also, another country that's been gripped by protests, reports suggesting that at least 90 people, and that was yesterday, have been killed so far in Bangladesh as the clashes between police and anti-government protesters continue. Some police officers, we understand, have been killed as well. Do we know what has caused these protests?
Real violent protests there, and that led to many people being killed. And the Prime Minister has since resigned and fled the country. Earlier on, it was reported that she landed in India. There are reports that she might be flying to the United Kingdom. But the question is, you are also going to a country that is having its own challenges. And this was sustained by young people again in that country who didn't back off when they were called to do so, but continued today, and they stormed the private residence of the Prime Minister. We saw those visuals when they entered the house, and therefore young people again taking to the streets, and also finally having their way in terms of ensuring that the Prime Minister does resign. And this is a head of the country in that country, and therefore you can see that you know, many times the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, when he was addressing the G7, the G20, he did warn leaders of the world, particularly the developed nations, that developing countries' citizens are becoming restless, and the developed nations must do something to address to assist the developing countries so that they can address the socio-economic challenges their citizens are facing. And we see this thing now, it's growing, it's in the continent, you see it in Asia, you see it in other regions such as South and North America in some countries, and therefore really the world experiencing all these challenges. And I remember the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, when I asked him 4 months ago about what's happening in the globe, he said the world is in turmoil, and it looks like indeed the world is in turmoil.
And speaking about the continent, last week we were seized with the developments in Zimbabwe around the arrest of some of those activists, and there were fears that there would be more arrests, especially, you know, the criticism even leveled against the country ahead of the SADC summit. What's the latest?
Well, more arrests, we are told, did happen, and some people characterizing this as abductions. And therefore, we saw weekend the Minister of Home Affairs, who's also responsible for security, issuing a statement, a very tough statement, that they will not back off as government officials in terms of clamping down on the perceived attempts to destabilize or to cause chaos ahead of the SADC meeting. But the reality is, if you look in South Africa, when you have these big conferences, you do have people who would march to Sandton Convention Center, or in KwaZulu-Natal, in Durban at the Convention Center, or Cape Town, expressing their views. And we've never seen South Africa clamping down on dissent or people who use such occasions to express their views. And therefore, now this has become a PR nightmare for Zimbabwe, because even people who didn't take note of Zimbabwe becoming the chair of SADC, they are now aware. And we saw diplomats in that country condemning what happened. We see more countries coming out, particularly where you have the human rights organizations. And this is now a nightmare for the country. And I don't know how the country is going to handle this, particularly next week leading up to the SADC summit in that country, because now the cameras, the writers, and many other people will be watching the development, and Zimbabwe is back on their agenda again.
And speaking about nightmares, stocks around the world tumbling as fears about U.S. economic slowdown shocked global markets, with some analysts saying that the market plunge has been disproportionate. What's the latest there?
Well, even today, when you look at South and North America, you see a similar trend. South Africa was not spared either. Earlier on, Asia was not spared. And therefore, there's a fear that if this doesn't stop, you are going to have a crisis, because some are predicting that this is a sign that next year, U.S. is likely going to be in recession. And if U.S. catches cold, the whole world will have a fever, and therefore the markets are going to have a problem, not only in North America, but even other regions as well. And here, people are saying it's because of the economic issues in that country, including the issue of jobs. But I think also the Middle East, the tension in the Middle East. Earlier on, I saw that the President of the United States of America has called an emergency meeting of the Security Council. You have Iran as we speak. There's an emergency meeting of the Security Council. We saw the Hezbollah launching those attacks yesterday. And tonight, we don't know what we can expect, because the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, did warn yesterday his G7 and G7 in particular counterparts that they expect Iran to retaliate in 24 hours' time, and we are now heading towards that deadline. And I suspect early hours of tomorrow we will be having headlines in terms of what's likely going to happen in the Middle East. We saw even other countries saying that their citizens must leave the Middle East, and people are stranded because there are no flights. When I came here, I saw reports that the airports are closed and therefore people can't come in or go out. But we saw a plane from Russia landing with the security minister of Russia, and he had a meeting with the security minister and the Security Council of Iran. And you know that it's being chaired by the leader of that country.
Sophie, always your finger on the pulse there. Thank you so much for bringing us up to speed with the world news in record time. Do appreciate it. That was SABC News International Editor Sophie Mokoena.